Nigeria built the largest single-train oil refinery on the planet. $20 billion. 650,000 barrels a day of capacity. A facility of a scale this country has not seen since independence. And instead of celebrating it, parts of the Nigerian state spent the next 2 years fighting it, in court, in the press, and through the quiet mechanics of licenses and crude supply. Why? Why would a government that spent decades begging for local refining suddenly treat its own refinery like a threat? The answer is not ideology. It is not incompetence, although there is plenty of that to go around. The answer is that a refinery this size does not just make fuel. It breaks a business model, a model that, for years, quietly enriched a small group of people who stood between Nigeria and its imported petrol. This is the story of Dangote versus NNPC and of the deeper war underneath it. Not a war over oil. A war over who is allowed to profit from the fact that Africa's largest oil producer could not, for decades, refine its own fuel. Let's break this down. Start with the contradiction, because the entire story lives there. Nigeria is one of Africa's largest crude oil producers, over 1 million barrels a day in good years, sometimes closer to 1.5 million. Yet for decades, the country imported the vast majority of the petrol its citizens burned because its own refineries, 4 of them, all state-owned, had collapsed into near-total dysfunction. This is not an exaggeration. By the late 2010s, Nigeria's state refineries were operating at a fraction of their nameplate capacity, in many years effectively at zero. The country was exporting crude and importing fuel, paying international refiners and shippers to do the one thing that should have been the national birthright. And because the state refineries did not work, the state itself became the importer. For years, the Nigerian National Petroleum Company, NNPC, was the sole importer of petrol into the country, not one of several, the only one. A state oil company had become, in effect, the country's fuel gatekeeper, and the fuel subsidy it administered became the country's most expensive and most abused financial instrument. Now let's talk about what Dangote actually built, because the numbers matter. $20 billion. That is the estimated cost, more than the GDP of many African nations. 650,000 barrels per day of refining capacity, making it the largest single-train refinery complex in the world. Over 30,000 workers at peak construction. The refinery was commissioned in May 2023, and in September 2024 it began producing petrol, premium motor spirit, for the first time. For a country that had spent decades exporting crude and importing the fuel refined from it, this should have been a national moment of pride. But the reaction from the institutions that had controlled the old system was not celebration, it was friction. Disputes over crude supply, disputes over pricing, disputes over who would be allowed to import and who would be forced to buy local. And by 2025, that friction had hardened into open conflict, with lawsuits filed by both sides and accusations of monopoly thrown in both directions. Now here's where it gets critical. To understand why the state would fight its own refinery, you have to understand what the refinery threatened to destroy. The first front in this war was over import licenses, and it is the clearest window into what is really at stake. Here is the question that started it. Once the Dangote refinery could produce enough petrol to meet Nigeria's needs, should anyone still be allowed to import fuel from abroad? Dangote's position was blunt. Import licenses, he argued, were being handed to companies that would simply continue shipping in foreign fuel, undermining the refinery's market, and worse, continuing the very import dependency the country had supposedly spent $20 billion to end. So in 2024, Dangote went to court. He sued the regulator, the Nigerian Midstream and Downstream Petroleum Regulatory Authority, the NMDPRA, along with NNPC and several import companies, arguing that the licenses they had been granted should be revoked. And then, in July 2025, Dangote quietly withdrew that lawsuit, without publicly explaining why. But the story did not end there. In 2026, the refinery returned to court, once again seeking to stop fuel import licenses granted to NNPC and other firms. Same fight, second round. Now here is where the story gets truly strange, because the two sides have essentially each accused the other of the same crime. In May 2026, NNPC filed a court document accusing the Dangote refinery of seeking to restrict competition and expose Nigeria's fuel market to monopoly control. The national oil company, for years the sole importer of petrol, was now standing in court and arguing that the private refinery was the monopoly threat. You have to sit with the irony of that for a moment. The institution that held a legal monopoly on petrol imports for over a decade was now the champion of open competition. And the private company that broke that monopoly was being framed as the villain seeking one. This brings us to the next point, and it is the heart of the entire story. This fight was never really about competition versus monopoly. It was about a transfer of position, about who would sit at the gate of Nigeria's fuel market. And both sides understood, better than any outsider ever could, that the gate is where the money is. The second front was even more revealing, because it was about the one input no refinery can survive without: crude oil. To run, the Dangote refinery needs a steady supply of Nigerian crude. But access to that crude is controlled by the state, specifically by NNPC, which allocates the country's crude cargoes. And here, the state held cards it used repeatedly as leverage. In October 2024, after months of tension, the two sides signed what was celebrated as a breakthrough: the naira-for-crude deal. Under it, the refinery would buy crude from NNPC in naira rather than dollars, a mechanism designed to relieve pressure on the currency and guarantee supply to the refinery. But the deal was short-lived and contested. Within months, the two sides were disputing its terms: how much crude had been supplied, in what currency, and for how long. By 2025, reports surfaced of a fresh 2-year supply agreement, and by 2026, the arrangement had effectively unraveled, with NNPC moving to discontinue the naira-for-crude mechanism entirely. The pattern here is the key point. Every time the refinery seemed close to stable, the terms of its survival were renegotiated, and the power to renegotiate them always sat on the state side of the table. To understand why the state fought so hard, you have to understand the machine the refinery threatened to dismantle. For years, Nigeria ran a fuel subsidy, a system in which the government paid the difference between the real cost of imported petrol and the artificially low price Nigerians paid at the pump. On paper, a social welfare tool. In practice, one of the largest and most corruptible cash flows in the Nigerian economy. Between 2015 and 2023, by official figures, Nigeria spent roughly 12.6 trillion naira on fuel subsidies. 12.6 trillion. That is a number so large it resists comprehension. Enough, in those years, to have rebuilt the country's refineries many times over, or funded its education and health systems, or simply not been stolen. And here is the critical part. Because NNPC was the sole importer, the subsidy flowed through a single state institution, one that, year after year, could not fully account for where the money went. The subsidy was not just expensive, it was opaque. And opacity, as we have seen in every story of Nigerian oil, is where the real money hides. So ask the obvious follow-up. Who stood to lose when the refinery came online? Not the public. The public's interest is obvious. Cheap, reliable fuel, refined locally, priced in a currency that no longer leaks at every transaction. No. The people who stood to lose were the people who had built their position inside the import subsidy machine. The importers, the middlemen, the shipping and logistics operators who moved foreign petrol into Nigerian ports, the traders who profited from the spread between international fuel prices and the subsidized domestic price, and, most significantly, the state actors whose influence and income were tied to the flow of imported fuel and the subsidy payments that accompanied it. A functioning refinery does not just produce fuel. It collapses this entire value chain. It removes the shipping leg. It removes the international trader. It removes the subsidy, or radically shrinks it. And it removes, most dangerously of all, the discretionary power of the gatekeepers who decided which companies would import, in what volume, and at whose profit. This is what Dangote actually threatened, not just NNPC's balance sheet. An entire ecosystem of rent that had fed on Nigeria's import dependency for a generation. And now the deepest layer, the one almost nobody covering this story says out loud. Nigeria did not become import dependent by accident. It became import dependent because import dependence was profitable for a specific class of people who had influence over the state. A country that refines its own fuel has no subsidy to administer, no import licenses to allocate, no crude for fuel swaps to negotiate, no middlemen to enrich. A country that imports its fuel has all of those things, and each one of them is a point of control, a gate where a decision must be made and where discretion can be monetized. This is the political economy of the thing. The state fought the refinery not because it was bad for Nigeria, but because it was bad for the people who had learned to extract value from Nigeria's dependence. The refinery represented a structural threat, not to fuel supply, but to a distribution of power that had been quietly consolidating for decades. This brings us to the next point, and it is the one that should make you angry. Now let's be fair, because the story has real nuance, and a documentary that pretends otherwise loses its credibility. The subsidy was removed in 2023 under the new Tinubu administration, a painful but, by most economists' assessment, necessary correction. And in its wake, the market began, slowly, to open. Dozens of private firms were licensed to import fuel, breaking NNPC's role as sole importer. The refinery came online. Prices floated. Some of the old machinery was genuinely dismantled. The fight over import licenses, looked at from one angle, is not purely about protecting rent. There is a legitimate policy question inside it. Should a single private refinery be allowed to become the sole supplier of a nation's fuel with no import competition to discipline its pricing? That is a real question. A monopoly is a monopoly, whether it wears a state logo or a private one. If Dangote becomes the only game in town, Nigerians are trading one gatekeeper for another. So the import licenses, in principle, are a healthy check. The problem is sincerity. The same state that now champions import competition spent a decade running the most complete fuel import monopoly in the country's history, and profiting from the opacity of it. To suddenly discover a devotion to free markets at the exact moment a private competitor arrives is not coherent policy. It is self-preservation dressed up as principle. So here is the question this entire story has been building toward, and it is not really about Dangote or NNPC at all. It is this: does Nigeria want to be a country that refines or a country that imports? Because the answer to that question determines everything that follows. It determines whether the national wealth from oil is captured at home or abroad. It determines whether the price of fuel is set in a Lagos boardroom or a Rotterdam trading floor. It determines whether the next generation of Nigerians works in refineries and petrochemical plants or queues for subsidized petrol shipped in from abroad. For decades, the incentives were built to keep Nigeria importing. The refineries were allowed to rot precisely because their rot was profitable. The subsidy was maintained precisely because its opacity was useful. The import licenses were fought over precisely because they were worth fighting over. A refinery this size changes that equation, not completely, and not without new risks of its own. but it forces the country to confront, for the first time in a generation, which future it actually prefers. And the resistance it has met tells you how deeply the old future had rooted itself. Let's bring it together, because this is the part worth remembering. Nigeria built a $20 billion refinery, the largest single train facility on Earth, and then spent 2 years watching parts of its own state try to keep the old import machine alive. The fight was dressed up as competition versus monopoly. It was never really that. It was about control. Who decides what fuel enters Nigeria? Who decides at what price? Who captures the margin between the crude Nigeria exports and the petrol it burns? For decades, the answer to that question kept shifting Nigeria's wealth out of its own hands, into the holds of foreign tankers and the pockets of the connected few. The refinery does not end that fight. It changes its terms. And the question now is whether Nigeria will let the new terms settle in favor of the country, or whether the old gatekeepers will find a new gate to stand at. Because here is the uncomfortable truth at the bottom of this story. A refinery is just steel and pipes. It produces fuel, but it does not produce political will. And until the will to refine, to compete honestly, and to break the chokehold of import dependence outweighs the will to preserve the old protections, Nigeria will keep fighting its own refinery no matter how much it costs and no matter how badly the country needs it. That is the real oil war. Not Dangote against NNPC, Nigeria against the people who profit from Nigeria's dependence. If this story hit you, and especially if you're in the maritime, oil trading, or downstream logistics industry, drop your thoughts in the comments. Which side of the import license fight do you actually stand on, and why? Make sure you're subscribed to SeaMayors and visit our external resource hub at the link in the description for the full source list, data figures, and more deep dives into maritime and oil trading economics. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.